NHL Trade Deadline has come and gone, so it's time to pass judgment on the winners and losers of some of these deals. Here to do that is RotoWire's Paul Bruno and AJ Scholz, along with host of the Fantasy on Ice podcast for NHL.com, Pete Jensen. So, Paul, which player who changed teams will see the biggest boost in fantasy value?
I'll give you three of them to think about, Jesse. Claude Giroux, obviously the clear choice. A second-line center spot next to Jonathan Huberdeau. That's not a bad landing spot to get next to the NHL's leading point getter, and I think he's going to thrive there. Rickard Rakell, second-line right wing next to Evgeny Malkin. I'm sure that's going to make AJ smile for a while. That's a great addition. And then Frankie Vitrano, a guy who's been scoring a depth role for the last couple of seasons. He now moves up to a second-line situation in New York with guys like Panarin and Strome beside him. That's also a pretty good setup.
All right, what do we think? Who's going to see the biggest boost in fantasy value, AJ?
Well, for me, it's actually Marcus Johansen joining the Caps. I think that's a huge boost for his fantasy value, especially considering they had him on the top line with Ovechkin and Kuznetsov this morning, in addition to joining up with the number 2 power play unit. Look, with Seattle, he was producing at an okay rate, but you look at his career in 7 years in Washington, he averaged 0.58 points per game, compared to 0.47 in his 5 other stops around the league. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he gets a look with power play 1. So Johansen, for me, biggest upgrade there. And look, I'll toss in a Terry Lehkonen. Like, he went from the Habs to the Abs. Like, that move speaks for itself.
All right, Pete, what do you think?
Very good points about all those guys so far. I especially like Rakell if he plays with Evgeny Malkin, but I'll go with Marc-Andre Fleury. I mean, he goes from a team on the Blackhawks that was not very good this season, but he still had 4 shutouts for them and was close to 500 with a decent save percentage. We know how good Fleury is when he's on one of the elite teams, and I do believe Minnesota is one of those elite teams. Their goaltending just kind of was shaky the past month or so and fell by the wayside, so give Bill Guerin some credit. He addressed their biggest weakness. Now they're going to be going into the playoffs. Even with Cam Talbot having a shutout last night after the trade, which is a good sign, by the way, right? That'll elevate the whole level of play for all the goaltenders involved on that team. But I fully expect Fleury to start game 1 of the playoffs, and they'll ride him as far as the Western Conference Final, maybe even the Cup Final if things go on their side. But I do think Fleury gives the Wild a much higher ceiling, futures-wise, and then fantasy-wise. Fleury gets a big bump. I think he's a top 10 fantasy goalie once again.
All right, how about a player that stayed on their team, right, but it's going to benefit from an arrival or perhaps even a departure, AJ?
I think Jake DeBrusk staying with Boston is the best thing for him right now in terms of fantasy value. Look, Bergeron is still out, could periodically miss time. And look, there's no guarantee Boston would have sent him somewhere where he could have stayed in the top 6. Realistically, I think he would have ended up on a third-line option for a lot of teams. So as far as guys who stayed, I think DeBrusk keeps his value there. Guys that are going to benefit, Paul alluded to this, Evgeny Malkin has gotten the biggest uptick in supporting cast with the addition of Rakell. He was producing despite playing with Danton Heinen and the struggling Kasperi Kapanen. With Rakell on his wing, you have to imagine we'll see a lot more production out of Gino. If there's one maybe negative you want to find there, he's probably not going to need to register 8 shots a night like he has for the last 2 games. So maybe his floor drops a little bit, but I would expect the assists will significantly tick up here.
Pete, who sticks out to you?
I'll go with a couple of guys we haven't mentioned so far. Vincent Trojek, contract year. I didn't expect him to be traded, but it was good to see the Hurricanes upgrade their forward group. In addition to re-signing Kokoniemi, they brought in Max Domi, who's had a very high fantasy ceiling in the past. So wouldn't be surprised if Trojek sees a little bump from that. And then, some of these other guys out there, I think like Charlie McAvoy is going to be a big beneficiary from having Hampus Lindholm on the first pair. Not that we were expecting McAvoy to be anywhere other than Boston, but just the fact that they went out and addressed that defense. McAvoy has stuck out to me over the years as one of the biggest workhorses at the defenseman position with very little support around him. So now they bring in a guy that's done some good things in his career, and I think will benefit largely from a change of scenery in Hampus Lindholm.
All right, Paul, a player that stayed on their team but's going to benefit from an arrival or a departure. What do you think?
Two youngsters now get better opportunities with their respective teams. I'm looking at Morgan Frost in Philadelphia. This guy was a first-round draft pick not so long ago. He's been trying to get a chance in Philadelphia. And now with Giroux's departure, he steps in into a top 6 role. And I think he's going to thrive there and be a long-term fixture there. That's how good I think he is. And then Taro Hirose in Detroit, they've made kind of a changeover in the Red Wings forward ranks in the last couple of years. And he's going to be a part of it now too. Similar profile to Frost. He was trying to get some traction in the top 6 role, but he was blocked. And now Nemesnikov's out of the way, and that paves his way to in there. And then another guy on the third line in Tampa is Ross Colton. He now has new line mates in Nick Paul and Brandon Hagel. And the Bolts are a team that looks very scary. Again, ready to defend and go for their 3rd Stanley Cup in a row. And the strength of that team was its depth, and now they got a better third line than they had even at that point.
Okay, big picture, Pete. Which team improved the most following this year's deadline? What do you think?
I got to say the Florida Panthers. I mean, they addressed a couple of their needs. They're really one of the deepest teams on paper that I've ever seen in my time covering the NHL. They got 5 different guys in their top 9 forward group, including Claude Giroux, who could play the center position at a very high level, which is amazing for them heading into the postseason. And even when you look at Aaron Ekblad being out longer term after his injury this past week, they addressed their defense with Ben Sherratt. You already know that Mackenzie Weegar is going to be able to fill in really well for Ekblad in the short term. And they have Spencer Knight playing really well for them with this recent absence of Bobrovsky. So when I look at winners of the deadline, Florida was already one of the deepest, if not the deepest, fantasy teams in the league. And they went out and got an elite player in Claude Giroux and also some insurance on defense with Sherratt. So to me, they hit a home run at this deadline. The past calendar year for the Florida Panthers, dating back to when they got Sam Reinhart too, that team just continuously improves month after month. So it's been good to see, and we'll see if they can knock off those Tampa Bay Lightning in the playoffs if they cross paths again.
Haha, we will see. Paul, which team improved the most following this year's deadline if you had to pick one?
I said the answer yesterday. These guys didn't hear it, Jesse. You might want to roll that tape. But I went with the Atlantic Division. All 4 teams improved themselves dramatically. That's quite an arms race for a group that includes 4 teams in the NHL's top 8 in the overall standings. I can't wait for the first 2 rounds in these playoffs, and my focus will definitely be there. They are all outstanding clubs. They all improved.
All right, AJ, what do you think?
It's got to be the Panthers. I mean, Pete is so right here. Like, Giroux adds to that already deep forward group. And again, according to today's morning skate, he's going to be on the top line with Verhaeghe and Barkov. In fact, they're so stacked with forward talent right now that at practice today for the power play, they just put 5 forwards on the number 1 power play unit with Ekblad out. Obviously, when he comes back, that'll change, but it has to be the Panthers. And look, I'll give a nod to Anaheim here. They've now got to combine 8 picks in the first 2 rounds over the next 2 drafts. They're going to have a ton of cap space here. So I think they did really well here, kind of selling off, building for the future. Although some of that does depend on what the outcome is of the Dadonov debacle after they traded for a guy that they can't apparently have because he doesn't want to go there. So we'll see how all that plays out. But even without that, I think they did a really good job.
All right, now let's get real here. Which trade did you dislike the most? Maybe because of the fit, the return, or the lack of impact, Paul?
You hit on it right away, and I'm going to surprise AJ because I talked glowingly about this guy 2 weeks ago. Then I started watching him play. I'm talking about Max Domi to Carolina. I don't know that there's any other conclusion with this player that to say that he's copped an attitude that has prevented him from being the same player he was in junior, a skilled guy who plays with an edge. I thought he was a physical force in this league, but I started to look at his numbers. He has 15 hits on the season. That's 1-5. That's 1 more than Willie Nylander. And his scoring has kept him in a third-line role much of the season on a bad Columbus club. I think Coach Brindamore will be challenged to get more out of him. This will be this will go one of 2 ways, and it could be a disaster in the dressing room too. So I don't know about this look in Carolina for Domi.
All right, AJ, where are you going with this one?
Well, I guarantee you if the Leafs had traded for Domi, he would be singing a different tune. It would have been the best acquisition that has ever happened in the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. There's no way he would have said a bad word about Domi if he had gotten his way and traded for him. But look,
drama.
if anybody says anything other than the Travis Hamonic deal, you're kidding yourself. Like, they gave up a third-round pick for a guy that Canucks were trying to offload. He's way overpaid at $3 million a year, which you're on hook for next year, too, for a guy that hasn't hit the 20-point threshold since 2015-16, and he's not getting any faster. The other one I'll throw out here is St. Louis. I'm not sure Nick Leddy is the addition they needed on the blue line. There were a ton of other defensemen that were traded that could have been a better fit here. And not only that, but they gave up a depth guy in Oscar Sundqvist when they probably actually needed to add some forward depth here. So you don't get the right blue liner. You give up too much here. I didn't love the St. Louis Blues day either.
All right, Pete, which trade did you dislike the most?
Well, I definitely respect what Paul said, and I agree that, like, technically everybody in the Atlantic got better, but I think Florida got a lot better. Tampa got a little bit better. Boston got a lot better, and Toronto got just slightly better. I was really surprised that Toronto didn't address the goaltending position, especially after that kind of fiasco with waiving Peter Mrazek, and they were playing Shalgren, but then he got lit up over the weekend. They didn't address their goaltending really, even with some decent rentals out there to try to pursue, whether it was Korpisalo or, Craig Anderson. I think they all might have been a good short-term stopgap and potentially more if they worked out. Instead, they got Mark Giordano, who's a nice player, reunites with TJ Brody, but he's 38 years old, and the best production of his career is way in the rearview mirror, let's be honest. So, I'm just a little puzzled by the Maple Leafs because they're kind of a win-now team, right? If it's not now, it's never. The window was only slightly open in recent years, and now it may be closing. So, I thought they should have done a little bit more in the goaltending front, to be honest. And I think the Giordano trade is maybe a little overrated in fantasy.
All right, well, let's sneak in a question about tonight's NHL DFS slate. All right, we got 11 games to choose from, so just who's your favorite play on the slate, AJ?
Well, I'm going to add some breaking news to this one because it wasn't totally clear, but Rickard Rakell is going to play for the Penguins tonight. He was obviously traveling from far away. He's been dealing with an injury, but he's going to be in the lineup. So you're going to get a guy that's going to play on Evgeny Malkin's wing for $2,500. It's an absolute steal here. Marcus Johansson, who I talked about earlier, comes in at just $3,000, top line guy for them as well. I think both of these are your clear value plays tonight, and then you can spend up in other spots. Maybe you go with with Ovechkin rather to go with Johansson. You could double up and go with Malkin and Rakell. I think both of those would be great plays to kind of go high-low and stack some teams tonight.
All right, Pete, what do you think? Favorite play on the slate?
Another team that stood pat at the deadline for the most part, as far as big names, is the Edmonton Oilers, but they've been playing well lately. I like what that offense is up to, especially with how Evander Kane's been playing. But look at Tyson Barrie. I mean, this looks like the Tyson Barrie from last year when he led all defensemen in scoring for the season. Was off to a slow start, coaching change. Now he's back on power play one with McDavid and Draisaitl and Evander Kane. Three guys that are elite fantasy forwards. Yes, even Kane has been a great story since joining the Oilers from the Sharks after that whole situation. But Tyson Barrie has a bunch of multi-point games lately, 12 points, 8 on the power play in his past 11 games. Sign me up for Tyson Barrie, even on the road against Dallas. I think he's also due for his first road goal of the season with how well he's been playing. Wouldn't be surprised if that came tonight.
Paul, 11 games. Who is your favorite play on the slate?
Well, I'm looking at the teams versus one another here on puck line bets. So I'm looking at the Rangers and the Jets to beat up on their opponents. The New Jersey Devils won't make the playoffs. They've got a nice looking team, but the Rangers are one of the elite clubs in the league. That's going to be a nice payoff at plus 155. And I like the Jets over a Vegas club that is just stumbling into the finish line. I don't think they're going to make the playoffs, and Jets look like they're fighting for their lives, so I'm going to be on them, hoping that they can pull off the win minus 1.5 to get me a 155 payoff there.